The day my brother announced he was writing a book, I smiled so hard my cheeks hurt. "That's amazing, Jake," I said, genuinely meaning it. It wasn't until I heard Mom, Dad, and his girlfriend Julie practically canonizing him over pasta that I felt something start to bubble under the surface. Jake had always been the golden child, the straight-A student, the college athlete, the one who inherited Dad's artistic gene. Now he was adding aspiring author to his ever-growing list of accolades. I mean, good for him, right? But when Mom leaned forward, clasped her hands together like she was praying, and said, "Oh, Jake, it's just so brave of you to follow your passion," something in me snapped. "Yeah, it's great," I said, swirling spaghetti on my fork like I didn't have a care in the world. Writing a book is a huge commitment. Of course, writing a grant proposal for my nonprofit was no picnic either. But hey, I'm sure your book will be creative. Julie looked up from her glass of wine, her perfectly arched eyebrow inching higher. "Grant proposals?" she asked. "Isn't that just like paperwork?" "Oh, no," I said, flashing my best performative smile. "It's research, pitching ideas, securing funding. It's the backbone of keeping programs alive. Not everyone gets it, but it's basically storytelling with real-world stakes." "But, Jake's story sounds fun." Jake glanced at me, but he didn't say anything. Maybe he didn't notice the edge in my voice, or maybe he was choosing to ignore it. Either way, the dinner carried on. I told myself I'd let it go. I didn't. 2 weeks later, I found myself at a family barbecue. It was supposed to be a light-hearted day, but Jake was glowing again. He'd finished his first draft. Mom was all but crying over his dedication, while Dad, who once doodled a picture of a tree and won a regional art contest, was gushing over how talent runs in the family. "That's great, Jake," I said, trying to keep my tone light. I remember when I finished my first project at the nonprofit. It was a huge deal. I guess for books, though, the hard part is finding people to actually read it. This time, Jake didn't let it slide. "Yeah, but writing's different," he said, his voice cool but pointed. "It's personal. You're not just following a template or trying to convince someone to sign a check." Julie chimed in, ever the cheerleader. "Exactly. Anyone can write proposals, but storytelling? That's an art." I laughed, a little too loud, earning a glance from my mom. "Oh, sure. I mean, storytelling is an art. It's just that in my field, I'm telling real stories. About people's lives. Situations that actually impact the world." Jake's jaw tightened, and Julie's mouth opened. But before she could say anything, Mom clinked her glass for attention, saving me from whatever rebuttal they were cooking up. Crisis averted, for now. Later that week, Jake sent me his draft. Maybe he wanted my feedback. Maybe it was a peace offering. Either way, I read it. Well, I skimmed it. It was fine. Good. Even, if I were being honest, but something about admitting that felt like an act of surrender. So when Jake called to ask what I thought, I said, "It's a great start. You've got potential." I mean, I'm no literary critic, but it reminded me of the stories I helped craft for our annual report last year. Concise, clear, a little amateurish, but heartfelt. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Amateurish?" Jake repeated, his voice tight. "I mean it in a good way," I said quickly. "Like, it's raw, authentic. You just need to polish it. Nothing wrong with that. First drafts are supposed to be rough." "I wasn't asking for advice," Jake said. "I was just sharing something I was proud of." "Well," I said, laughing nervously, "you're welcome for the honesty. Most people would just nod and smile." Jake hung up shortly after, leaving me feeling vindicated yet hollow. I wasn't being mean, right? I was offering constructive feedback, but part of me wondered if it really needed to be constructive at all. Then came the straw that broke the camel's back. Mom decided to host a small celebration for Jake's progress. A celebration for a draft. I showed up out of obligation, the pit in my stomach growing as soon as I walked in and saw the banner. "Congratulations, Jake." Seriously? It was like he'd won a Pulitzer. During dinner, Jake started talking about the plot of his book. Something about a coming-of-age story in a small town, inspired by our childhood. He was in the middle of describing the main character when I couldn't help myself. So, basically, it's our lives, I said, half laughing. That's not exactly original, is it? The room went silent. Jake stared at me, his face blank. Julie set down her glass a little too hard. Do you have a problem with him writing, or do you just not like it when the attention isn't on you? She asked, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. What? I said, startled. No, because every time he shares something, you find a way to downplay it or turn it into some competition. What's the deal? Are you jealous? I'm not jealous, I said, my voice rising. I'm just saying it's not groundbreaking to write about your own life. And excuse me for having an opinion. Jake stood up, his chair scraping loudly. You know what? Forget it. I don't need this. He walked out, Julie following him with a glare in my direction. Mom and Dad didn't say anything, but the disappointment in their eyes was enough. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I wasn't trying to tear him down. I was just being honest, offering perspective. Isn't that what families do? Now, a week later, I'm sitting here replaying it all, wondering if maybe, just maybe, Julie was right. Was I jealous? Or was I just telling the truth? Either way, the question lingers in my mind like a bad aftertaste. AITA? I always knew Aunt Carol was quirky. She had this eccentric charm, like a character in one of those old detective novels she loved to read. Her house was filled with mismatched furniture, odd trinkets from estate sales, and walls painted in shades that should never coexist but somehow worked. But even with her oddities, she was the family glue, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and always had a pot of tea ready when you needed to talk. So when I came over one Thursday afternoon to drop off a casserole, her favorite cheesy broccoli, naturally, and found her standing in the backyard, staring at a mound of dirt, I didn't think much of it. Aunt Carol did things like that. Once, I caught her conducting a ceremony to banish moles from her garden. She'd waved sage around like a wizard while wearing rubber boots and a tiara. So, yeah, quirky, but this time felt different. Her shoulders were slumped, and she didn't acknowledge me until I was practically right beside her. Hey, Aunt Carol, I said, holding up the casserole. Brought reinforcements for your fridge. She jumped a little, startled, then gave me a quick, distracted smile. Oh, hello, darling. Just taking care of the garden. Her garden didn't look like it needed much care. It was winter, and most of the beds were dormant. But I nodded, playing along. Looks like you're burying treasure, I joked. Her face froze. Then she forced a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Something like that. The silence stretched. My curiosity gnawed at me. I glanced at the mound of dirt again. It was fresh, the soil dark and loose, like it had just been turned over. And sticking out at the edge, barely visible, was a corner of something plastic, a bright yellow tarp. Aunt Carol, what's under there? I asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. She hesitated, her gaze darting between me and the mound. Just some old things I needed to get rid of. That was not reassuring. Things? Like what? Nothing you need to worry about, she said, a little too quickly. Just cleaning up. Her tone was meant to shut me down, but now I was laser-focused. Carol, come on. You're acting weird. Is it, I don't know, something illegal? Should I call a lawyer? Her laugh burst out, this time genuine. Oh, for heaven's sake, no. It's not drugs or anything criminal. Then why do you look so guilty? I asked, raising an eyebrow. She sighed deeply and gestured toward the house. Let's have tea. I'll explain. Inside, the familiar smell of cinnamon and old books wrapped around me. Carol set the kettle on the stove and rummaged in a tin for cookies. Her movements were precise, like she needed something to focus on. I sat at the table, waiting, a knot of anticipation tightening in my chest. When she finally sat down across from me, she avoided my eyes. You remember that neighbor of mine, Mrs. Fenton? Sure, I said. The one who yells at squirrels? Carol nodded. Well, she passed away a few weeks ago. Oh, that was sad, but not exactly headline news. Mrs. Fenton had been in her 90s. I'm sorry. She had a peculiar request for me before she died, Carol said, her voice low. She wanted me to take care of something for her. Something she couldn't trust anyone else with? I leaned in, intrigued. What kind of something? Carol hesitated, then dropped the bombshell. Her pet iguana. I blinked. Her what? His name was Ferdinand, Carol said, as if this explained everything. She loved him like a child, but she knew her kids would, well, dispose of him the moment they got the chance. I stared at her. Wait, so, the thing buried in your yard. It's Ferdinand, she said, her voice heavy with solemnity. He passed away 2 days ago. I couldn't just throw him away. Mrs. Fenton trusted me. I didn't know what to say. You buried a lizard in your backyard? Yes. Carol's lips pressed into a thin line. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention this to anyone. It's not exactly HOA approved. A laugh bubbled up before I could stop it. Carol, you're acting like you buried a body. I did bury a body, she hissed. A beloved one. I couldn't stop laughing now. The absurdity of it all. The secret tarp, her guilty expression, the reverence in her voice, was too much. Carol tried to look offended, but eventually, she started laughing too. Later, as I helped her clean up the dishes, I felt a pang of guilt for prying. She'd been trying to do a good thing, honoring a promise to an old friend, and instead of respecting that, I'd acted like a nosy detective. As I was leaving, I hugged her tightly. Sorry for being so pushy, Aunt Carol. Ferdinand was lucky to have you. She smiled, a little teary-eyed. You're a good egg, darling. But next time, just ask before assuming I'm up to something nefarious. Now, every time I walk past her garden, I wonder what the neighbors would think if they knew about the grave under the rose bushes. I don't think Ferdinand will haunt me, but Aunt Carol might if word gets out. AITA for sticking my nose where it didn't belong? It started as a brilliant idea, or at least I thought so at the time. Carl, my closest work buddy and reigning king of bad puns, had just finished his third joke about spreadsheets for the day. Excel yourself, he'd shouted as we all groaned. I laughed because Carl was Carl, annoying but endearing, like a golden retriever who occasionally knocks over your coffee. But the jokes weren't what got to me. It was his smugness. The way he held court in the break room like a stand-up comic who thought he was playing Madison Square Garden instead of performing for a tired audience of cubicle dwellers. I decided he needed a dose of humility. Something small, harmless. That's when I got the idea of the switcheroo. Carl was particular about his coffee. Black, no sugar, 2 ice cubes, always 2. To cool it down, but not too much, he'd say with an exaggerated wink. So, one Monday morning, while Carl was in a meeting, I swapped out the grounds in his coffee tin for decaf. Nothing extreme, just a little prank to see if he'd notice. He didn't. At least, not at first. But by the third cup, his energy had dipped noticeably, and by the end of the day, he was practically horizontal in his chair. I couldn't resist. Tired, Carl? Maybe cut back on the caffeine, I said, barely hiding my grin. His eyes narrowed. You did something to my coffee, didn't you? I shrugged, but my smirk gave me away. Carl nodded slowly, like a sheriff in an old western sizing up the outlaw. All right, he said. Game on. The next morning, my keyboard was sticky. Not jammed or unusable, just sticky enough to make typing an ordeal. I spent 15 minutes with a bottle of rubbing alcohol and a stack of cotton balls, muttering curses under my breath. Carl walked by and gave me a cheerful wave. Sticky keys? Must be all that hard work you're doing, he quipped. The gloves were off. That night, I stayed late, sneaking into Carl's office to set up my next move. Carl loved his desk plant, a little succulent he'd named Bertha. He talked to it sometimes when he thought no one was listening. I carefully replaced Bertha with a fake plant, the kind you'd find in a dollar store. The next morning, Carl stared at it, tilting his head like a confused puppy. Then he poked it. Bertha feels weird, he said. Maybe she's evolving, I offered with a straight face. Carl's lips twitched, but he said nothing. The escalation was on. The next day, I opened my drawer to find every single pin I owned replaced with crayons. A rainbow of waxy frustration stared back at me. Carl leaned over the cubicle wall. You're an artist, right? Thought you could use some supplies. I laughed, but now it was personal. That weekend, I crafted my piece de resistance. Carl had an unhealthy attachment to his phone. He treated it like a lifeline to the outside world. So, I created a fake text chain between him and a fabricated, secret admirer. I even bought a burner phone to send the messages. "Hey Carl, it's been so hard keeping this in, but I think you're amazing," I typed, grinning like a villain in a bad sitcom. Carl's face when he got the first message was priceless. He went red, then white, then a suspicious shade of purple. He spent the rest of the day glancing around the office, trying to figure out who his admirer might be. I let him stew in it for a full 48 hours before fessing up. He didn't laugh. "You're messing with my personal life now," he said, eyes hard. "Come on, it was a joke," I replied, but his expression didn't soften. The retaliation came swiftly and brutally. Monday morning, my computer desktop had been replaced with a giant, unflattering photo of me eating a burrito during a team lunch. Mid-bite, guac smeared across my cheek. The caption read, "Productivity in progress." Worse, Carl had emailed it to the entire office. I confronted him, but he just smiled. "Maybe you shouldn't mess with people's coffee, huh?" The stakes rose from there. Carl rigged my chair with an air horn. I filled his desk drawers with packing peanuts. He hid all my shoes during a company bowling night. I signed him up for a ferret enthusiast newsletter. By the time we reached the week of the company holiday party, we were practically circling each other like two cats fighting over the last patch of sun. The party was supposed to be our détente, a chance to call a truce. But instead, it became the scene of the most catastrophic prank of all. Carl had brought a date, his first since a messy breakup months ago. Seeing an opportunity, I snuck over to the DJ booth and convinced the guy to play a recording I'd made earlier. An embarrassing voicemail Carl had left me during a drunken night out months ago, confessing his undying hatred for karaoke and his secret fear of clowns. As his voice filled the room, Carl froze. His date looked confused. The room erupted in laughter, but Carl didn't join in. He stormed out without a word, leaving me with a pit in my stomach. The next day, I found my desk completely empty. My computer, papers, pins, everything was gone, even the chair. A single sticky note sat in the middle of the barren surface. "Check the roof." I climbed the stairs, dreading what I'd find. There, under the cold gray sky, was all my stuff. My monitor sat precariously balanced on a folding table. My chair had been duct taped to a vent. Carl stood next to it, arms crossed. "Truce?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He shook his head. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. You think this is funny?" "It was supposed to be," I said quietly. But now it wasn't. We stared at each other, both too stubborn to apologize, both too tired to keep fighting. But neither of us could bring ourselves to be the first to stop. The damage was already done. AITA? The day my mom and I declared war over an antique mirror was the day I realized family feuds don't need to make sense. They just need to feel justified. And oh, this felt justified to both of us. The mirror in question had hung in my grandmother's bedroom for decades. A tall, intricately carved thing with a gilded frame that looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Legend in our family said the mirror was cursed, not in a literal haunted ghost way, but in a nobody's allowed to touch it, or Granny will roll in her grave way. My mom inherited it when Granny passed, and it was her crown jewel. She'd placed it on the landing of our house, where it caught just enough light to make it look even more dramatic. Mom called it the portal. Everyone else called it the creepy mirror. So, naturally, when I moved into my new apartment, I thought the mirror would make a killer centerpiece. It wasn't like my mom needed it. It just sat there, collecting dust and scaring the dog when the sunlight hit it wrong. And if I'm honest, there was a bit of spite behind my decision. Mom and I had been in this weird power struggle ever since I moved out, like she didn't quite know how to let go. Taking the mirror was my subtle way of saying, "I'm an adult now, deal with it." I didn't steal it outright. Well, not exactly. I borrowed it. She'd gone to visit my aunt for the weekend, so I recruited my friend Jake to help me haul it out of the house. The thing was heavier than it looked, and we nearly dropped it twice getting it into his truck. But by the time I got it into my apartment and hung it on the wall, I was euphoric. The mirror looked perfect. It gave my place this air of old-school elegance, like I was a tragic character in a period drama. I took about 30 selfies with it before passing out that night. Smug as hell. The storm hit the next morning. Mom called me at 7 a.m. sharp, her voice icy and clipped. "Lena," she said, in the tone reserved for family emergencies or me forgetting her birthday. "Where's the mirror?" I froze mid-toast. "What mirror?" "You know what mirror," she hissed. "The portal. It's gone." I tried to play dumb. "Oh, weird. Maybe Dad moved it?" "Don't you dare lie to me, Lena," she snapped. "I know you took it." My brain scrambled for excuses, but my mouth betrayed me. "Okay, fine. I have it. But it looks amazing in my place, Mom. You should see it." "I don't care how it looks," she shouted, loud enough to make my neighbor bang on the wall. "You had no right to take it without asking. Bring it back. Now." "Mom, come on," I argued. "It's just a mirror. You weren't even using it." "It's not just a mirror," she growled. "That belonged to your grandmother. It's priceless." "It's not priceless," I shot back. "It's a gaudy antique that you're weirdly obsessed with. Why can't I have it? I'm your daughter. Isn't it still in the family?" "You're not ready for it," she said, her voice eerily calm now. "That mirror has history, Lena, and responsibility. You don't just borrow it for Instagram clout." I laughed. "Responsibility? It's a mirror, not Excalibur." "That's exactly why you're not ready," she barked. "You don't understand what it means." We argued for another 10 minutes, circling the same points until she hung up on me. I was too stubborn to give in, and she was too furious to negotiate. For the next 2 days, she sent me guilt-trip texts about family legacy and Granny's wishes, while I dug my heels in deeper. I wasn't about to let her win. Then the weird stuff started happening. It was subtle at first. The mirror would fog up for no reason, even when the room wasn't humid. Then I started noticing faint smudges on the glass, like fingerprints that didn't match mine. Once, I caught my reflection moving when I wasn't. I chalked it up to stress, or maybe too much caffeine, but the vibe was off. Jake came over one night, took one look at the mirror, and said, "Dude, why does it feel like this thing is watching me?" "Don't be dramatic," I told him. "It's just a mirror." He shrugged. "I'm just saying, it's giving me bad juju." That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. In the dream, I stood in front of the mirror, and my reflection didn't move with me. Instead, it smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't belong to my face. Then it whispered, "Bring me back." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. For the first time, I wondered if my mom's warnings hadn't been entirely ridiculous. Maybe the mirror was cursed. Or maybe Granny had been into some weird occult stuff we didn't know about. Either way, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I caved. I texted Mom, "Fine, you win. I'll bring the stupid mirror back." Her response was immediate. "Good. Do it before sundown." Sundown? What was this, a vampire movie? But I wasn't about to argue. I called Jake for backup, and we wrestled the mirror back into his truck. The thing felt heavier than before, like it didn't want to leave. By the time we got it back to my mom's house, I was ready to throw it on the curb and run. Mom was waiting for us on the porch, arms crossed, looking more smug than relieved. "I told you," she said, as Jake and I lugged the mirror back to its spot on the landing. "You could have warned me it was haunted," I grumbled. She smirked. "I did. You didn't listen." "Is it safe now?" I asked, half joking. She just patted the mirror like it was a pet and said, "The portal knows where it belongs. Let's not make this mistake again." I'm still not sure if the mirror was actually cursed, or if my guilt and imagination got the better of me. Either way, I learned my lesson. Don't mess with family heirlooms. Or my mom. AITA? Saturday morning, I stood at the edge of my front yard, staring at the dented mailbox that had somehow become a metaphor for my life. Worn out, bent under pressure, and still expected to do its job. My neighbor, Mr. Harrow, waved cheerfully as he mowed his pristine lawn, oblivious to the hurricane brewing inside me. I forced a smile and turned back to my house. Inside, my phone buzzed aggressively on the kitchen counter, a siren call I wasn't ready to answer. It was my cousin Tara this time. leaving me another voicemail. Hey, just checking in. We really need your help with the charity bake sale. You're the best at organizing, and honestly, none of us can manage without you. Call me back, okay? Her voice dripped with desperation wrapped in obligation. I poured myself another cup of coffee and ignored the voicemail. This wasn't like me. Normally, I'd have already drawn up color-coded schedules, ordered bulk flour, and drafted a peppy group email by now. But something inside me refused to budge. I had reached my limit. For years, I'd been the family Swiss Army knife, jumping in to fix problems at the drop of a hat. Need an extra pair of hands for moving day? Call me. Dog needs surgery, and you can't afford the deposit? I've got you. Lost your job? Sure, crash on my couch for a few weeks. But those weeks often stretched into months, and my yes seemed to have become their default assumption. It wasn't just my family either. At work, I was the go-to for covering shifts and picking up slack. My friends expected me to coordinate every birthday party, every road trip. Somewhere along the way, I'd become everyone's safety net, so tightly stretched that I'd started to fray. But today, I wasn't picking up. My resolve solidified as I sipped my coffee, watching sunlight dance across the cluttered kitchen table. For once, I wasn't going to clean it up. I wasn't going to fix anything. I was going to spend the day doing absolutely nothing, and if the world fell apart without me, so be it. An hour later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. Hi, sweetheart, she began, her tone unnervingly sweet. I heard from Tara that you might not be helping with the bake sale. I just wanted to remind you how much the community counts on us for this. It's for a good cause, after all. I bit back the words forming in my throat. I know, Mom, but I can't this time. I'm tired. There was a pause, just long enough to make me squirm. Tired? Honey, we're all tired. That's what family does. We push through for each other. I wanted to yell, to tell her that I'd been pushing through for years, that I was tired of always being the one to push. Instead, I said, sorry, Mom. Not this time. Her sigh was heavy, almost theatrical. Well, I hope you know what you're doing. People are counting on you. By the time she hung up, my chest felt like it was wrapped in barbed wire. Guilt gnawed at me, but so did something else, anger. A quiet, simmering anger that had been building for years. I spent the rest of the day on the couch, binge-watching a show I didn't even like, determined to enjoy my rebellion. But the world outside didn't let me forget. Texts rolled in like waves, each one more pointed than the last. Seriously? From Tara. This is so unlike you. From my sister. We're really disappointed. From my mom. My resolve began to wobble, but I forced myself to hold steady. That evening, I decided to order pizza and eat it straight out of the box like a delinquent. As I waited for delivery, I got a call from my brother, Alex. He rarely called, which meant this wasn't going to be good. Against my better judgment, I answered. Hey, he said, his tone cautious. What's going on? Everyone's freaking out because you're not helping with the bake sale. I needed a break, Alex. I can't keep doing everything for everyone. There was a long silence. Okay, but couldn't you have told them that in a way that didn't make you sound selfish? I laughed bitterly. Selfish? I've been there for everyone, every single time, without fail. And the one time I say no, I'm selfish? He sighed. It's not that simple. People rely on you. You're the responsible one. It's kind of your thing. Well, I'm done being the responsible one, I snapped. Let someone else handle it for once. The conversation ended in a terse stalemate, and I spent the rest of the night picking at my pizza and wondering if I'd made a mistake. Was I selfish? Was I letting everyone down? Or was this what taking care of myself looked like? By Monday, the storm hadn't passed. Mom sent me a carefully worded email about family obligations. Tara posted a passive-aggressive thank you on Facebook, tagging everyone who had helped. Even Alex texted me a meme about flaking that hit too close to home. I thought back to all the times I'd stepped up without hesitation, all the moments I'd put my needs last. Did any of that matter now? Or was my value to them tied solely to what I could do for them? So here I am, sitting on my couch again, staring at my dented mailbox and wondering if I've become the bad guy in my own story. Should I have just sucked it up and helped? Or is it okay to draw a line, even if it means disappointing the people I care about? AITA? It started with a potato masher. Not just any potato masher. A weird, ancient-looking one with a carved wooden handle and a head shaped like a spiral instead of the usual grid. It belonged to my grandmother. She brought it over from Germany when she immigrated decades ago. She loved telling the story of how her father had whittled the handle himself during the war, using some magic technique passed down in the family. To her, it wasn't just a kitchen utensil. It was a relic, a piece of history tied to survival and resilience. To me, it was a potato masher. A funky, old one that probably hadn't touched an actual potato in years. It sat on her mantle like some weird piece of folk art, nestled between porcelain cats and a photo of her wedding day. So, when my friends and I decided to do a vintage aesthetic photo shoot for Instagram, it seemed like the perfect quirky prop. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. I just thought it looked cool. My grandmother wasn't home when I borrowed it, so I left her a sticky note. Borrowed your magic potato masher. Back soon. Red heart seemed harmless enough. She always said family was more important than objects anyway. I figured she'd laugh about it later. The photo shoot was going great. We were at this old train station, the kind of place that was all peeling paint and rusted signs, and the masher fit right in. I was using it as a wand in one shot, pretending to summon potatoes from the ether. In another, we staged a mock sword fight with it. My friend Nina joked that I looked like a kitchen witch. I was genuinely having fun, and for a moment, I felt like I understood why my grandmother treasured it so much. There was something satisfying about its weight, the worn smoothness of the wood. It felt alive, like it carried stories. And then I dropped it. The head snapped clean off. 1 second, it was in my hand, and the next, it was a spiral of metal rolling down the cobblestones. The handle hit the ground with a sickening crack. I froze, staring at the pieces, hoping they'd somehow put themselves back together. Nina gasped, "Oh my God, is it, like, expensive?" "No," I said quickly, even though I wasn't sure. "It's just old." I picked up the pieces and examined the handle. A crack ran straight through one of the carvings. "You think you can fix it?" Nina asked. "Maybe." I didn't sound convincing, even to myself. Back home, I Googled every possible way to repair a wooden handle. I even called a woodworker, who quoted me more money than I'd ever spent on a single meal. Gluing it didn't work. The crack was too deep. I tried not to panic. It was just a potato masher. Surely my grandmother wouldn't really care. I'd explain it was an accident, that I hadn't meant any harm. She'd understand. When I returned it, broken and poorly glued, she didn't say anything at first. She just held the handle in her hands, running her fingers over the crack like it was a wound on her own body. Her silence was worse than any yelling. Finally, she asked, "Why did you take it?" I stammered through some explanation about the photo shoot, about how it looked cool and fit the vibe. "I was going to bring it back right after," I said, trying to sound casual. "I didn't think it was a big deal." "It's not about the thing," she said quietly. "It's what it means. This was your great-grandfather's. He made it during a terrible time, with his hands, because he didn't have money for tools. We used it to make food when there was nothing else. He said it would bring luck. And now," her voice trailed off. "I'm really sorry," I said, meaning it. I didn't know it was that important. I just thought it was, an old potato masher. She shook her head. "You didn't think at all." Her words hit harder than I expected. It was true. I hadn't thought. I'd seen it as an object, not as a symbol of survival or family history. To me, it had been a quirky Instagram prop. To her, it was a piece of her father, a reminder of a life I'd never had to live. I offered to replace it, to buy her a new one. She laughed bitterly. "A new one? What good would that do? Would it have your great-grandfather's hands in it? Would it have the story?" I left her house feeling worse than I ever had. The photo shoot pictures were still on my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them. The likes and comments rolling in felt hollow. People loved the kitchen witch theme, calling it whimsical and genius. But every time I saw the cracked handle in my mind, it felt like a weight pressing on my chest. A week later, I found a box on my doorstep. Inside was the potato masher, now glued and sanded so smoothly you could barely see the crack. Along with it was a note in my grandmother's handwriting. I've lived through worse than a broken handle, but some things are worth more than a story. Be better next time. I don't know if she forgives me. She hasn't brought it up again, but every time I visit her house, I see the masher back on the mantel. It's crack visible if you look closely. It's like a scar now, a reminder of carelessness, of thoughtlessness, and of the fact that some things aren't yours to take, no matter how harmless it seems. AITA? There was no word in the human language for the way the sky fractured that morning. It wasn't a crack or a ripple, more like the air itself had decided it was tired of being invisible and wanted to show off. In any other part of the world, it might have gone unnoticed, a shimmering, faint as the tail end of a dream. But here, in the valley where sound carried secrets and light bent at impossible angles, everyone noticed. Or at least, I did. Standing barefoot in the grass with my mug of lukewarm coffee and an armful of regret. It was quiet at first. Too quiet. The kind that makes your brain go searching for reasons to panic. Even the crows that usually perched on the crooked fence post were gone. That's when I saw it. A thread of silver unraveling across the sky, as if someone had taken a seam ripper to the atmosphere. I blinked, once, twice, and then it was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. That would have been the logical conclusion. But logic and I had been on shaky terms ever since the incident with the mailbox. The thing about living in a town, so small it doesn't have a name, is that everyone knows your business. Or at least, they think they do. When the mailbox exploded last week, Mrs. Calloway down the road swore up and down it was those troublemakers from the next county over. I didn't have the heart to tell her it wasn't dynamite or fireworks, but something much stranger. Something alive. The scorch marks were still there, spiraling out like an alien crop circle on my front lawn. But nobody paid them any mind. Teenagers, Mrs. Calloway muttered, adjusting her binoculars as if that solved everything. But I knew better. The scorch marks weren't from this world. And neither was the thing that had slithered out of the mailbox just before it imploded, leaving behind a whisper of heat and the faint scent of oranges. I tried to tell Danny about it. Danny, my best friend and occasional partner in crime. But he just laughed and said I'd been drinking too much cold brew. You've got to lay off that hipster rocket fuel, he said, ruffling my hair like I was some over-imaginative kid. Next thing you'll tell me, Bigfoot's renting out the guest room. That was the thing about Danny. He made it easy to doubt myself, to tuck my strange experiences away in a mental drawer labeled Do Not Open. But this morning, standing there with my coffee and my silence, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was about to happen. Something big. The first sign came just after sunrise. A low hum, barely audible, vibrating through the earth like a tuning fork struck miles below the surface. It wasn't constant, more like a pulse, syncing up with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. I stumbled back inside, dropping my mug on the counter, and turned on every light in the house as if that could chase away the unease settling in my chest. And then the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the door, too deliberate to be the wind. My first thought was Danny, maybe showing up unannounced like he always did. But when I peered through the peephole, the porch was empty. That's when I noticed the envelope. It was the kind of thing you'd see in old spy movies. Heavy parchment, sealed with red wax, stamped with an unfamiliar insignia. I hesitated, my hand hovering over it like it might bite, before finally picking it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded so precisely it felt almost surgical. The words were written in a language I didn't recognize, curved symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer when I tried to focus on them. But the strangest part was that I could understand them anyway. Not in my head exactly, but in my bones. You are being watched. My first instinct was to laugh. A dark, nervous laugh that didn't belong to me. But as I stood there, rereading the note, a cold realization settled over me. Whoever, or whatever, had written this wasn't lying. I could feel it now, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my skin like a phantom breeze. The question wasn't if I was being watched. It was why. I decided I wanted to throw a party that was more than just a gathering. It would be a work of art. Something immersive, surreal, unforgettable. I spent months planning it, a masquerade dinner with a dreamscape theme. The invitation was simple, a handmade card with the words, "Come as the version of yourself that lives in your dreams." But everything else was a sensory overload. I hired a chef to create dishes that looked like illusions. I designed lighting that shifted through the evening, mimicking the colors of a sunset dissolving into twilight. Even the music was curated to feel like you were wandering through someone else's subconscious. It was going to be my masterpiece. The guest list, of course, was just as meticulously curated. I had this theory that the right mix of people would make the evening feel like alchemy. I invited the kind of friends who wouldn't just show up, they'd embody the theme. I even told everyone there'd be no social media allowed, to make the night feel like stepping into another plane of existence. It had to feel real, sacred, ephemeral. But then there was Colin. Colin is my oldest friend. We grew up down the street from each other and have shared everything from Halloween candy to heartbreaks. He's funny and loyal, and always there when I need him. But Colin is also a chronic joker, the guy who'd show up to a black tie event in a hot dog suit just to see everyone squirm. He has this energy that's hard to describe, a chaotic magnetism that people either love or can't stand. At every party we'd been to together, Colin was the guy with the loudest laugh, the boldest moves, the biggest everything. And I knew if he came to my dreamscape dinner, the event would become the Colin show. I wanted something else for this night, something quieter, stranger, more ethereal. Colin would crash into that atmosphere like a cannonball into a still lake. I told myself it wasn't personal. This wasn't about him being a bad friend or me being ungrateful for his years of loyalty. It was just about the event and the balance of it. So, I didn't invite him. When the night came, it was everything I hoped for. People arrived in costumes that were like poetry in fabric. One friend came as a version of herself with feathered wings and golden eyes, another as a living statue in cracked marble. The food was an edible hallucination, dishes that smoked and glowed. People danced in slow, hypnotic circles, whispering secrets in shadowy corners. At one point, someone recited a poem that made everyone fall silent, like the air had turned electric. I floated through the night, feeling like I'd created something bigger than myself. Something magical. I didn't think about Colin until the next morning. I woke up to a text from him. No emojis, no punctuation, just 5 words. So, I wasn't dream material? I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I typed back, it wasn't like that. But what could I even say? That I didn't trust him not to be himself? That his very presence would have undone the fragile atmosphere I'd been chasing? That his loud laugh and wild energy didn't fit into the dream I'd built? Every explanation felt like an accusation, and every word felt like a betrayal. So I didn't reply. By mid-afternoon, Colin called. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but guilt picked up the line for me. "Hey," I said cautiously, "you think I don't get it?" His voice was light, almost teasing, but with an undercurrent of something sharp. "You think I don't know why I wasn't invited?" "It wasn't personal, Colin," I began. Just what? Didn't trust me not to embarrass you?" His voice cracked, and suddenly the teasing was gone. "You could have told me. You could have said, 'Hey, this is important to me. Tone it down.' But instead, you just erased me." "I wasn't trying to erase you," I protested, feeling my face flush. "I was just trying to keep the vibe intact. I knew it wouldn't be your thing." "Let me decide what's my thing," he snapped. "That's what friends do. They give you a choice. But you didn't even give me the chance. You just decided who I am and shut the door." I couldn't argue with that, so I said nothing. "Do you know how humiliating it is?" he continued, his voice quieter now. "To see all those photos, to hear everyone talking about this amazing night you created, and realize you thought I'd ruin it? That you thought I wasn't good enough to fit into your dream?" "I didn't think you weren't good enough," I said, but the words felt hollow. I thought you'd stand out too much. That you'd be you." He laughed then, but it was a bitter, broken sound. And here I thought that's why we were friends. The line went dead before I could reply. It's been 3 weeks, and I haven't heard from him since. I've replayed the conversation in my head 100 times, trying to decide if I was right to protect the night I'd envisioned. or if I'd sacrificed a friendship on the altar of my own ego. I keep telling myself it wasn't personal, that I was just trying to create something unique. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe it was always personal. AITA? When Mila suggested the trip to the Arctic, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Standing in our cramped Brooklyn apartment with a half-empty suitcase on the bed, she talked about how this sabbatical of the soul would reset our lives. The plan was to spend 6 months at an eco-research station, her doing her nature photography, me assisting with logistics and documenting the experience for a travel magazine. "I'll email Dr. Heikkinen tonight," she said, folding her thermal socks with a precision I found disturbing. "But we should start preparing. There's so much gear we'll need." "Already on it," I replied, gesturing toward my laptop. "I've got a checklist. Clothes, food, medical supplies. We can divide tasks and knock it all out this week." Mila sighed, the kind of sigh that was practically a punctuation mark in our conversations. "You can't plan everything, Leo. Let's get the essentials, sure, but part of this is embracing the unknown. What if the station doesn't have what we expect? What if the experience changes us in ways we can't prepare for?" I frowned, staring at my color-coded spreadsheet. "I'm not trying to overplan. I just don't want to freeze to death because we forgot extra gloves." "We won't," she said, brushing past me to grab her camera back. "You'll see. Some of the best moments happen when things go off script." Her optimism both infuriated and intrigued me. Mila thrived on chaos, believing it to be the seed of creativity. I, on the other hand, had built my life around preventing chaos. Yet here we were, a paradoxical duo on the brink of an adventure that required us to lean on each other's strengths. Or so I hoped. Over the next month, our apartment became an Arctic prep zone. I ordered emergency rations and frostbite kits, while Mila wandered through secondhand stores, picking up quirky trinkets to give the station some personality. Her favorite find was a ceramic polar bear figurine, which she claimed would keep the vibe friendly. I said nothing, though I mentally cataloged it under useless items. Our biggest argument came 2 weeks before departure, when I caught her packing a ukulele. "Are you serious?" I asked, holding it up like it was radioactive. "It's lightweight," she said defensively, "and it's good for morale. We need that space for equipment." I snapped, pointing to the mounting pile of batteries and solar chargers. "This isn't a vacation, Mila. It's 6 months of isolation in sub-zero temperatures. We need to focus on survival." "Music helps people survive," she shot back, snatching the ukulele from me. "Not everything is about efficiency, Leo." We glared at each other, and for a moment, I wondered if this was the dumbest decision we'd ever made. Could two people so fundamentally different really navigate something this intense together? We didn't speak much for the rest of the day, but that night, as we sat in the glow of our laptops, she broke the silence. "You know I appreciate what you're doing, right? You're the one making sure we don't end up eating reindeer moss because we forgot the dehydrated meals. And you're the one making sure we don't lose our minds," I admitted. "I just don't want to fail at this." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "We won't." The journey to the Arctic was an odyssey in itself. Planes, snowmobiles, and finally a sled dog ride that left me questioning every life choice. The research station was smaller than I'd imagined, a cluster of prefab buildings surrounded by nothing but snow and sky. Mila's face lit up the moment we arrived, while I started mentally cataloging the weak points in the structure. The first few weeks were a trial by fire, or ice, rather. My careful plans unraveled faster than I could patch them. The solar panels barely worked in the low light. One of the food containers froze solid, and Mila's camera lenses fogged up so badly that she had to improvise a dehumidifying chamber using silica packets and duct tape. "You planned for this, right?" she teased one night as we huddled under the communal blanket, sipping instant soup. "I planned for most things," I grumbled. "Not whatever this is." "This is life," she said, grinning. "Messy and unpredictable." Despite my frustrations, I couldn't deny that Mila's spontaneity kept us afloat. When the heater failed, she figured out how to channel warmth from the generator room. When the comm system went down, she rigged an antenna out of coat hangers. Her optimism wasn't just infectious, it was necessary. But I wasn't useless either. My meticulously packed inventory saved us more than once, whether it was a spare headlamp during a power outage or the first aid kit when Mila slipped on the ice and sprained her wrist. She never said it outright, but I could tell she was relieved I'd thought of those things. One night, after a particularly brutal snowstorm, we stood outside under a sky ablaze with the northern lights. It was the kind of beauty that defied language, a silence so profound it felt like the universe was holding its breath. Mila snapped photos, her injured wrist in a makeshift sling, while I simply stared, awestruck. "You know," she said, lowering her camera, "we're better at this than I expected." "At what?" I asked, balancing each other out. "You keep us grounded. I keep us moving." It was such a simple observation, but it felt profound. I thought about the ukulele sitting on the shelf inside the station and how she'd played it during the storm to drown out the howling wind. I thought about my spreadsheets, how I'd worried they'd be a burden but had ended up giving us a safety net. We were messy and flawed, but somehow, we worked. Still, as we packed up to leave months later, I wondered if I'd been too rigid, too obsessed with order. Maybe I hadn't trusted her enough, or maybe she leaned too hard on her belief that things would just work out. Either way, the trip had changed us. I just wasn't sure if it had made me right, or her. So, AITA? The first raindrop hit the glass with a soft patter, almost imperceptible amid the low hum of the cafe. Nina leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the pain as she stared at the figure across the street. He was standing under a flickering neon sign, his shoulders hunched against the drizzle. A cigarette hung loosely from his lips, its ember flaring intermittently like a distant signal. She knew it was him. She'd been waiting for this moment for 3 years. The cafe's door chimed, and the wind carried the scent of rain and regret. Nina stiffened. She didn't turn around but felt the weight of his presence as he approached, his footsteps deliberate and slow, like he was testing the ground with every step. "Still nursing that same latte?" His voice was gravelly, familiar yet foreign, like a song you once loved but hadn't heard in years. She turned, her heart a knot of emotions too tangled to unravel. He looked older, not in the way years aged people, but like life had wrung him out and left him crumpled to dry. His jacket was worn, the leather cracking at the seams, and a faint scar curved along his jawline. A new addition since she'd last seen him. "You've got some nerve," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Go on, then. Tell me why you're here." He didn't sit immediately, just stood there, studying her like she was a puzzle missing pieces. "You look good, Nina. Different." "Save it," she snapped. "You didn't come here to catch up. What do you want?" Finally, he sat, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped together like he was praying. For what? She didn't know. "I need your help." Nina laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Of course you do. That's what you do, right? Show up, disappear, then reappear when you need something." She pushed her latte aside, the cup nearly toppling. "What is it this time, Jake? Money? A place to crash? Or did you finally run out of people to screw over?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" she demanded. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks an awful lot like déjà vu." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table. Nina hesitated before picking it up. The image was grainy, like it had been printed on a dyeing machine, but she recognized the face immediately. A little girl, no older than 6, with curly hair and eyes too big for her face. Her heart stumbled in her chest. "Who is she?" Nina's voice was barely above a whisper. "She's mine," Jake said. "Ours." The world tilted. Nina gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "What the hell are you talking about?" "She's your daughter, Nina." "I didn't know. Not until recently. Her mother. She passed away. Cancer." He broke off, running a hand through his hair. "I found out through the will. She named me as her guardian." Nina stared at him, the words hitting her like hailstones, cold and relentless. "You're lying." Jake's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "I'm not." The room seemed to shrink, the air too thick to breathe. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't anyone tell me? I didn't know, he repeated, his voice cracking. By the time I found out, it was too late. But now, I can't do this alone, Nina. She needs you. We need you. Nina stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the floor. Her mind raced, fragments of thoughts colliding like shards of broken glass. She grabbed her coat and bag, throwing them over her shoulder. This isn't my problem, Jake. Not anymore. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to keep walking. Nina, wait. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting off whatever he was about to say. The rain greeted her like an old enemy, soaking through her clothes in seconds. She walked quickly, her breaths coming in sharp, ragged bursts. The photograph was still in her hand, the little girl's face staring back at her. She reached the corner of the street and stopped, staring at the puddles collecting on the pavement. The city buzzed around her, indifferent to her turmoil. She wanted to tear the photograph in half, throw it into the gutter, and let the rain carry it away. But she couldn't, because somewhere in the depths of her soul, past the anger and betrayal, a small, insistent voice whispered the truth. She turned back toward the cafe, her steps hesitant but deliberate. When she opened the door, Jake was still there, his head in his hands. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise and relief. I'll meet her, Nina said, her voice firm. But don't think for a second this means I forgive you. Jake nodded, his expression solemn. That's all I'm asking. The rain had stopped by the time they left the cafe, replaced by a quiet drizzle. Nina tucked the photograph into her coat pocket, its edges softened by the damp. She didn't know what the future held, or if she could ever untangle the mess of her past. But for the first time in years, she felt something other than anger, hope, or something like it. We were 6 months deep into wedding planning when my cousin Beth cornered me at a family dinner. Her wedding was 2 weeks before mine, and somehow, the lines had blurred between what was hers and what was mine. Hey, she said, leaning in conspiratorially, do you mind splitting the bachelorette limo rental? I know it's technically for your night, but we're both using the same company, and I figured, why not share costs? I blinked at her, unsure if she was joking. The limo rental was for my bachelorette party, and it was already a stretch for my budget. But I didn't want to start a family feud. Sure, I guess, I said reluctantly. She grinned, patted my hand like she'd just done me a favor, and flitted off to schmooze with Aunt Clara. That was just the start. Beth had an uncanny talent for inserting herself into every part of my wedding. She wanted to borrow my florist. They've already done all the hard work designing bouquets, right? Use my caterer's menu, just swap out the shrimp for chicken, easy peasy, and even asked if she could borrow my wedding shoes after the ceremony. At first, I let it slide because she was family. By month 5, I started feeling like I was hosting 2 weddings, hers and mine. The straw broke when it came to the wedding welcome bags. I'd painstakingly put them together for my out-of-town guests, tiny jars of local honey, artisan chocolates, and handwritten thank you notes. Beth saw them during one of her planning visits to my house and immediately swooped in. Oh my gosh, these are perfect. Can you make a few extras for my guests? I'll totally Venmo you for the cost. I laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. She left that night with a list of the bag items and a cheery promise to circle back. Fast forward to last weekend. I'd hosted a casual get-together for friends who were helping me with the final details of the wedding. Beth showed up uninvited, again, with a bright smile and a tote bag of chaos. Just dropping off my contribution to the welcome bags, she said, plopping down 5 dusty mason jars of homemade trail mix. I glanced at her, then at the jars. They were filled with off-brand granola and what looked suspiciously like crushed pretzels. What is this? Your honey and chocolate are so elegant, but I thought adding something rustic would give it a personal touch. I was about to protest when my fiancé pulled me aside. Let it go, he whispered. It's not worth the fight. But then came the final kicker. The day after the party, I was cleaning up and noticed a Venmo notification on my phone. It was from Beth. She'd sent me $20 with a note. For my share of the bags. THX cuz. I stared at the screen for a solid minute, baffled. $20? The honey alone had cost $75. The chocolates were another $50. The bags, the ribbon, the notes, forget it. Her trail mix probably cost $5, and now she wanted to call it even? That's when the thought crept in. I don't have to send this money back. At first, I felt a twinge of guilt, but the more I thought about it, the more justified I felt. I'd been footing the bill for Beth's freeloading since the moment she got engaged. I'd given her my florist, my caterer, my limo, and now she wanted to shortchange me on my own wedding prep? No, that $20 was staying in my account. Consider it reparations. A week later, Beth texted me, "Hey, just wanted to check if you got the Venmo? Can't wait to see the bags finished." I left her on read. The next day, she messaged again, "Hey, did you forget to order the extra chocolates for my guests? Just let me know what you need, and I'll totally pitch in." This time, I replied, "Oh, don't worry about it. I think everything is sorted on my end." She didn't push it, at least not at first. But a few days later, the group chat lit up. Beth had apparently started telling the family I was gatekeeping the wedding plans and taking advantage of her generosity. Generosity? The woman had Venmo'd me $20 and called it a partnership. I shot back in the group chat, "Beth, if you want to talk about generosity, let's discuss the florist, the limo, and the fact that you've hijacked half my vendors. I think $20 barely scratches the surface." Silence. Then she texted me privately, "Wow, I didn't realize you felt this way. I thought family shared things." At this point, I was over it. I sent her a single message, "Family also respects boundaries." Now, everyone's acting like I'm the bad guy for not rolling over. Beth has been frosty ever since, and I can tell she's telling people I'm being selfish. But am I really supposed to keep bending over backward while she plays the victim? Maybe I shouldn't have kept the $20, but at this point, I feel like I earned it. AITA? I came home one afternoon to find a plastic decoy duck perched smugly in the middle of my driveway. At first, I thought it had been blown there by the wind or abandoned by a wandering kid. But when I picked it up, there was a note taped to the underside. In shaky handwriting, it read, "Keep your leaves on your side of the yard." No name, no context, just a passive-aggressive duck and an impossible demand. Now, I live in a suburban neighborhood where the properties blend into one another like watercolors. My oak tree happens to sit right on the property line between my yard and my neighbor Doug's. Doug is a retiree with a passion for lawn care bordering on religious zealotry. His grass is greener than jealousy, his hedges are trimmed like they're in the military, and his driveway is so spotless you could eat soup off it. Meanwhile, my yard is what polite people might call naturalistic. I like my dandelions. They're cheery. I tried ignoring the duck, but the next morning, there was another one. This time, it was propped up against my door with a fresh note. "I'm serious. Rake your leaves." So I raked. Sort of. I gathered a half-hearted pile and left it out for collection, but a gust of wind sent some rogue leaves scampering back over the line. That's when the real games began. The following day, I woke up to find the ducks multiplied. 4 of them now stood sentinel along the property line, each one wearing a tiny sign. "Respect boundaries. Leaves are your problem. Consider composting." And the piece de resistance, "Doug sees you." It was so absurd I laughed, which was a mistake. By the time I returned home from work that evening, the ducks were gone. But Doug had escalated. A line of fluorescent orange survey flags now divided our yards. I stepped outside and waved him down. "Doug, is this really necessary?" I called. He emerged from behind a bush like a grumpy lawn ninja. "If you don't take care of your tree, I'll have to take legal action." "It's our tree, Doug," I said, "and you can't sue someone over leaves." He just glared and walked back inside. That's when I decided to retaliate. The next day, I bought a bag of plastic flamingos and planted them along his precious orange line. Each flamingo wore a small, hand-drawn leaf on its beak. It was subtle, yet unmistakably mocking. Doug's response came swiftly. He installed a motion-activated sprinkler system along the property line. I discovered this the hard way while trying to retrieve my mail. I was soaked to the bone, and Doug's face peeking out from his curtains told me it wasn't accidental. The escalation was a slow, ridiculous spiral from there. I started strategically blowing leaves onto his yard at night with a leaf blower. In retaliation, he began bagging them and dumping them on my doorstep. I planted a flower bed right next to the survey line. He installed a hedge to block it from view. I left sunflower seeds near his patio so squirrels would take up residence in his yard. He retaliated by leaving a pile of dog poop, not from any dog he owned, directly on my welcome mat. One day, I came home to find a tarp strung between 2 poles in his yard with the words, "Tree Menace," spray painted across it in neon green. That was it. I called an arborist to inspect the oak tree and prove it wasn't the leaf-spewing monster Doug claimed it was. The arborist took one look at the tree, scratched his beard, and said, "Beautiful specimen, completely healthy." I triumphantly handed Doug the report, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. A week later, he hosted a block meeting. Flyers were shoved into every mailbox, including mine, with a single bold title, "The Leaf War, a Neighborhood Crisis." To my shock, people actually showed up. Doug had laid out a detailed PowerPoint presentation about the unchecked tyranny of my tree. He included photos of his lawn pre- and post-leaf fall, grainy security footage of me raking improperly, and even a graph tracking the number of leaves over time. When it was my turn to speak, I simply held up the arborist report and said, "It's a tree. It's doing what trees do. Get over it." The meeting ended in a stalemate. A few days later, I noticed something strange. The ducks were back, but now they were in my yard. They lined up in a single row, facing my house. One of them wore a tiny bow tie. Another had a piece of paper taped to it that read, "Doug apologizes." I stared at them, bewildered, until Doug himself shuffled over. He looked sheepish, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "So, turns out I might have overreacted," he mumbled. "What changed your mind?" I asked. Doug gestured toward the oak tree, where a family of robins had built a nest in the branches. The wife saw them and said they were cute. She said the tree can stay. Just like that, the war ended. I kept the ducks as a trophy, but even now, whenever the wind kicks up and the first leaves start to fall, I can feel Doug's eyes on me. AITA? The idea came to us in the most ridiculous way possible. A game of Scrabble. I had just laid down excursion for a triple-word score, smugly sipping my tea while Alex glared at the board. They hated losing at Scrabble. Excursion? Alex muttered, absent-mindedly rearranging their tiles. "You mean, like a vacation?" "Exactly," I said, leaning back with a grin. "Maybe we should actually take one. Get out of this wintry abyss and go somewhere fun." Alex perked up at that. "Yes, somewhere warm, somewhere sunny, a beach, a resort." Their voice grew dreamier with every word, like a hypnosis victim falling under the spell of a travel brochure. "Or," I said, interrupting their reverie, "somewhere wild, like Iceland or Patagonia. Hiking, glaciers, maybe even some kayaking with whales." Their dreamy expression froze, then transformed into one of barely concealed horror. "You want to hike on vacation? For fun?" "Yes, for fun," I said, narrowing my eyes. "You know, moving your body, seeing epic views, feeling alive." Alex shuddered. "That sounds like my personal nightmare. I vote for margaritas by the pool and books. Lots of books." We sat there, each staring at the other as if the other had just confessed to enjoying pineapple on pizza. "Okay," I said slowly, "we clearly have different ideas here. Let's figure this out like rational adults." So we made lists. On the back of an envelope, I scrawled words like mountains, adventure, culture, and thrills. On their side, Alex wrote spa, sunshine, cocktails, and absolutely no hiking. At one point, they added nap-friendly in all caps, as if I'd missed the message. The thing is, we weren't just bickering over logistics. Alex worked at a law firm and spent their days in a hurricane of stress. To them, vacation was a life raft in a sea of chaos. Peace, quiet, and a steady supply of fruity drinks were non-negotiables. For me, it was the opposite. My job, if you could call it that, was managing a local climbing gym. It was fun, sure, but routine. I craved adventure the way Alex craved calm. Sitting still for too long felt like caging a bird. I needed to go. Still, we wanted this trip to be special, something to cement this new phase in our relationship, and we didn't want to ruin it by forcing the other person to live through their worst-case scenario. Okay, I suggested one evening, pacing the living room like a trial lawyer. What about a compromise? We could do half beach, half adventure. Alex gave me a skeptical look from their spot on the couch, legs curled under a blanket. So, what? 2 days in a hammock, then you drag me up a mountain? Not drag, I said defensively, more like lovingly encourage. They laughed but shook their head. It's not just about splitting days. I don't know. It's like our ideas of fun are totally opposite. Wouldn't that just make it harder to enjoy being together? I flopped down beside them, staring at the ceiling. They weren't wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the problem wasn't logistical. It was philosophical. To me, the trip was a chance to push boundaries and collect stories. To Alex, it was a rare opportunity to escape the relentless demands of real life. How could we possibly combine those things without one of us feeling shortchanged? The next day, in a moment of inspiration or desperation, I proposed something radical. What if we let fate decide? Alex arched an eyebrow. Fate? You mean like a coin toss? Nope. I held up a weathered box I'd dug out of my closet. It was one of those choose-your-adventure card games I'd bought years ago and never used. We make the trip into a game. They blinked. A game? Yeah. Look, we'll shuffle the cards, and every card gives us a mini adventure or activity to do. One card might say build a sandcastle, and another might say ride a zipline. We have to follow whatever it says, no complaints. Alex stared at me like I'd grown a second head. You want to plan our vacation with a card game? Exactly, I said, grinning. It's random, it's fair, and it'll keep things interesting. Plus, you love board games. Board games, Alex said dryly, are not the same as letting a deck of cards control my life. But fine, let's try it. If I get a card that says, hike to the nearest volcano, I'm burning this thing. We spent the next few weeks customizing the cards to reflect our preferences. Half adrenaline-fueled escapades, half luxurious relaxation. We threw in some wild cards, like try a food you've never heard of or find the weirdest souvenir. By the time we booked our flights to Thailand, the game was ready to go. The first card, drawn at a Bangkok street market, said, buy something you'd never normally buy. I ended up with a questionable t-shirt featuring a cartoon crab saying, you're pinch me crazy. Alex, to my utter shock, bought a sparkly pineapple-shaped purse they immediately dubbed Piney. Another card sent us to a jungle zipline course. Alex screamed the entire time. Part terror, part exhilaration, but by the last line, they were grinning like a kid on a roller coaster. The next day, a card let Alex lounge by the resort pool while I went snorkeling. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. By the end of the trip, we'd built sandcastles, visited a hidden temple, tried fire dancing, badly, and spent a blissful afternoon napping in a beachside cabana. It wasn't the vacation either of us had envisioned, but somehow, it was better. Every card felt like a shared adventure, whether it was thrilling or absurd or unexpectedly peaceful. On the flight home, Alex leaned over and whispered, you know, Piney and I had a great time. Me too, I said, smiling at the memory of Alex ziplining. Maybe you're more adventurous than you think. Maybe, they said, smirking, or maybe you're just better at lounging than you realize. So, AITA for leaving our trip in the hands of a deck of cards? My best friend, Claire, was finally opening her dream bakery, Sugar and Bloom. She had poured years of her life into it, saving every penny, taking night classes on patisserie techniques, and running endless taste tests on anyone willing to eat a dozen experimental eclairs. Her obsession with detail was unmatched. She even designed a logo that merged a sugar flower with a rising sun, a symbol of hope and growth. Naturally, I'd been dragged into the chaos of preparation as her unpaid but highly valued assistant. She loved to call me her Chief Emotional Support Officer, which was code for person who has to taste test at 2 a.m. and haul 50-pound flour bags. I didn't mind though. Claire was my ride or die, and her happiness meant everything to me. The grand opening was a big deal. She'd managed to secure coverage from a popular local food blogger. The mayor was planning to swing by, and there were enough pre-orders to keep her oven working overtime. But most of all, her mom was flying in from Texas. Claire had a complicated relationship with her mom, a mix of love, intimidation, and desperate need for approval. She never outright said it, but I could tell this bakery was her chance to prove she wasn't just Claire the Dreamer, as her mom often called her. By the time the opening day arrived, the bakery looked like something out of a fairy tale. Pink and gold accents, shelves lined with delicate pastries, and fresh flowers at every table. Claire was buzzing with nervous energy, checking and rechecking the macaron display like it was the Sistine Chapel of desserts. "It has to be perfect," she kept whispering, almost like a prayer. That's when I got the idea. "Now, you need to know something about me. I've always been the clown of our duo. If Claire was the responsible, hardworking one, I was the irreverent chaos agent who kept things fun. For years, she told me that my jokes helped her de-stress, especially when she was in one of her perfectionist spirals. So, when I saw the beautiful display of her signature lavender honey cupcakes, perfectly swirled and sprinkled with edible glitter, I knew exactly how to lighten the mood. I grabbed a spare cupcake, smeared the frosting haphazardly onto my face like war paint, and marched into the middle of the bakery with my arms outstretched. "Behold," I declared, my voice booming, "the great lavender beast has awakened. Who dares to challenge my glittery wrath?" A few people chuckled, mainly Claire's college friends who were already used to my antics. But Claire? She froze. I mean, stone cold, deer in headlights, what have you done froze. At first, I thought she was just startled, maybe even holding back a laugh. So I upped the ante, roaring dramatically and swiping another cupcake to smash onto my chest. "The beast demands sacrifice." Or, like, a latte. Either works. Then I noticed her mom. Oh, her mom. She was standing near the counter, dressed in one of those expensive tweed blazers that scream respectability. Her face was a mix of confusion and outright horror, as if she just watched someone vandalize the Mona Lisa. Next to her was the food blogger, furiously typing notes into her phone, probably captioning it. Grand opening turns into frosting disaster. Claire's voice finally broke through the awkward silence. "Sophie, what the hell are you doing?" I stopped mid-roar, realizing too late that this wasn't landing as I'd hoped. The room felt like it had been vacuum sealed. Even the espresso machine hissed in judgment. "It's a joke?" I said weakly, wiping frosting off my cheek. "You were stressed, so I thought." My voice trailed off as I took in Claire's expression. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't even smiling. She looked betrayed. "Do you think this is funny?" she snapped, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. "Do you think I've worked this hard for you to turn this into a circus?" "I know. I was just—" "Just what?" she interrupted, her face flushed. "Trying to embarrass me in front of everyone? My mom? The blogger who's going to write the review that could make or break my business. What is wrong with you?" Her words hit me like a slap. Embarrass her? I wasn't trying to embarrass her. I was trying to help, to make her laugh, to take the edge off what I thought was just opening day nerves. But looking around, all I saw were judgmental stares, uneasy shifts, and Claire's dream. The bakery she'd spent years building, teetering under the weight of my stupidity. The rest of the event was a blur. Claire avoided me entirely. Her mom gave me the coldest "nice to meet you" I've ever received, and the food blogger left without so much as a smile. I stayed long enough to help clean up, but it was clear I wasn't welcome. When I finally left, Claire didn't say goodbye. That night, I replayed the scene over and over in my head, trying to understand where I went wrong. Sure, the timing wasn't perfect, and maybe frosting war paint was a bit much, but wasn't it harmless? I didn't mean to ruin anything. Couldn't Claire see that? Still, her words haunted me. "Do you think this is funny?" I had thought it was. I had thought she would. But maybe I misjudged her. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe she's just taking this whole thing too seriously. It's been 3 days, and Claire still hasn't returned my texts. I tried calling once, but it went straight to voicemail. Mark, my boyfriend, says I need to give her space and apologize when she's ready. But apologize for what? For being myself? For trying to lighten the mood? I don't know. Am I missing something here? Or is Claire overreacting? Ida,